Thank you for joining us today, folks. I'm in Cyprus. I woke up this morning about 5:45 to sirens over Jaffa. It turns out the Houthis fired a missile at Tel Aviv and it was shot down. That's one of two missiles that the Houthis fired at Israel today. The second one blew itself up. Now, Israel yesterday or last night struck the port at Hodeidah again with drones. They hit it with drone strikes. And they're continuing to pound Yemen on a semi-regular basis here. And just remember, the Houthis have fired several hundred missiles at Israel since the resumption of the war back in March. None of them have hit anything of consequence in Israel. Israel has done several hundred sorties, and the United States, against the Houthis in that time frame, and virtually everything they hit blows something up. The problem is there's just not that much to blow up in Yemen. We've talked about that before. And so it's just they're doing the best they can. They had a heavy equipment apparently that was trying to repair the port at Hodeidah so that they could bring in more stuff. That's how they get the majority of their weapons from Iran, for example. And Israel's nope, blow those earth movers up, stuff like that. The Yemeni government, not the Houthis, but the actual legitimate government of Yemen, just the other day confiscated a shipload of weapons coming from Iran to the Houthis with likely intelligence help from the United States. Very good chance the U.S. tracked that ship coming out of Iran. So the U.S. tracked it, sent that information to the Houthis. Like I said, we've got advisors on the ground in Yemen with the legitimate government of Yemen down in the south, and they stopped and confiscated all these weapons. So they are making it more difficult for the Houthis to continue their reign of annoyance over Israel. That's about all it is, just a reign of annoyance. It's costing the Houthis a lot more than it's costing Israel at this point to defend themselves from the Houthis. And that's the way it ought to be. It's also costing the Gazans a lot more than it's costing Israel as the IDF pushes into Deir al-Balah, the area where they have never been before, where they believe some of the hostages may be held. Obviously, this is a tragic, terrible event, a tragic, terrible war for Israel. But as I've pointed out many times before, the Israelis are exacting a much higher price from the Palestinians, as well they should. That is just. They just had 28 nations that joined together to condemn Israel and tell them to stop the war immediately. Just think about what that would mean. They wouldn't get their hostages back, and Hamas would stay in power, which means that a whole nother generation of terrorists would be brought up in Gaza. And at some point in the future, more Israelis would be taken hostage and murdered by Hamas and their minions, their affiliates. That's what the world body is saying. They're saying because people are suffering in Gaza, and they are. There's no two ways about it. People in Gaza are suffering. But because they're suffering in Gaza, Israel needs to voluntarily lose the war and give Hamas the victory here. If Israel stopped fighting and went home tomorrow, they're not getting all their hostages back, and Hamas will be dancing in the streets in uniform, firing their guns in the air, and continuing to oppress the people of Gaza for the foreseeable future. And that's just a non starter. Despite the suffering that is happening in Gaza right now, despite the hunger and the people that are dying every day, it is better overall for Gaza for Israel to continue to prosecute this war to the fullest extent until Hamas is no more and they can replace it with somebody reasonable or semi-reasonable. And the short-sightedness of Keir Starmer in Great Britain and the PM of New Zealand and Spain and France, these left-wing idiot governments, to say, no, because people are suffering in Gaza. And look, there's such a thing as just suffering. Sometimes you ought to suffer because of things that you've done. This is not arbitrary suffering that's being imposed on Gaza. It is called consequences. You are still holding hostages. Try letting the hostages go, and all this can end. So Israel is winning. There's no two ways about it. I want to talk to you just real quickly. Let me tell you about Cyprus. A lot of people don't know much about Cyprus, so I wanted to give you some background on it. We can go to the map here and look at the island of Cyprus. It's the first place where Paul and the disciples went on their first mission journey. Lazarus is buried here the second time. It feels like a Greek island. So it's been inhabited by Greeks for more than 3,000 years. And as a matter of fact, Cypriot, the language here, is a version of Greek. It'd be like the difference between the Greek people speak in Greece. If that was American English, then in Cyprus, they would speak something like Scottish. So it's pretty close. And again, it's been full of Greeks for 3,000 years. So it's got a lot of history here. Now, back in the 16th century, the Ottoman Turks took over the island, as they took over almost everything else. And they started moving people to Cyprus. So that caused some problems later on from like 15 something to 1870s. So about 200 years, the Ottoman Turks ruled Cyprus. And then the British colonial rule took over in 1878, and they ruled until 1960. So almost 100 years. Under British rule, the Greeks that lived in Cyprus began demanding that they could join Cyprus to Greece and make it another Greek island. They called that enosis. And the Turks that still lived on Cyprus, they were a minority, obviously opposed that and wanted either to completely partition the island or continue the British rule. So Cyprus gained independence from Great Britain in 1960, and their constitution at that point guaranteed power sharing between the Greeks and the Turks. So what they did was kind of like Lebanon. They said, okay, we're going to have a Greek Cypriot president and a Turkish Cypriot vice president, and they'll share power. But that didn't last very long because those two groups could not get along very well. It collapsed into violence and protests and stuff in 1963. So it lasted about 3 years. Eventually, UN peacekeepers were deployed here in 1964, and that lasted for 10 years. Then in 1974, there was a coup that installed a pro-Greek military junta. And this caused a lot of consternation in Turkey, which feared that Greece was going to annex Cyprus and persecute the Turkish Cypriots that lived here. So in 1974, the Turks invaded and they seized about not quite 40% of the island up in the north. And so that's what you see here with this line that traverses the island like this. This is the demilitarized zone between Greek Cyprus down here and Turkish Cyprus up here. Now, Greek Cyprus, being a Christian nation, is prosperous, safe, growing, beautiful, cared for. Turkish Cyprus today is essentially failing. They're heavily dependent on Turkey for pretty much everything. Much dirtier, much more rundown, just typical for the difference between anytime you have a Judeo-Christian worldview underpinning a society and a Muslim worldview underpinning a society. The Muslim worldview is going to make that society much worse. Even if they have a lot of money, it's not going to be a nice place to live. In this case, the Turkish part of Cyprus does not have a lot of money. And so it's just more rundown and not as safe over there. You can actually cross over between the Greek portion and the Greek Cypriot portion and the Turkish Cypriot portion. You can go visit that area, but I wouldn't do it because it's run by the Turks, and the Turks are very prone to arresting people who are journalists. There are more journalists in jail in Turkey than any other country on planet Earth. And Turkey is not friendly to journalists at all. Okay, so let's get to talking about the Christian church that was attacked and burned by illegal Jewish settlers in Samaria a few days ago. The media has been just going ape over these illegal Jewish settlers that came and burned down a church in the West Bank, in one of the last Christian villages in the area. Now, let me ask you something. First of all, if you've watched those reports, why do you suppose there are not many Christian villages left in the Judea, Samaria? Why are there not a lot of Christians left there? Do you think it's because Jewish settlers bother those people, have harassed them to the point that they've just said, bag it, I'm going to move somewhere else? No, that's actually not what's happened. There are Christian villages in Israel proper, like the one that I go to all the time, Jish, where Christians are treated very well. And there's been some rumor about Christians being attacked in Israel, Christians under siege in Israel, Christians being spit upon and beat up by Jewish extremists. There's not a lot of truth to that. Now, there is some serious friction between the Armenian Christians in the Old City and Jewish developers who are trying to build a resort in the Armenian Quarter. And the Jewish developers bought the land, and they bought it from an Armenian bishop who sold the land without consulting any other Armenians, the Armenians who actually lived there. He just sold it to them, took the money, and ran. So it was essentially a criminal act on his part. And the rest of the Armenians, when they found out, said, whoa, wait, no, you can't build on our land. And so they've been protesting to stop it. Now, the Jewish developers who have paid for the land are saying, we paid for this, it's ours. So they've sent security in there and things like that to harass the protesters and try to get them to move. And so they're in a standoff still. And there are some small number of Jews who would love to see the Armenian Quarter become the Jewish Quarter and just kick those Armenians out. And so there is some friction there. But by and large, Christians are treated very well in Israel. Most Israelis understand those people are our friends. They support us, and therefore we like those people. Most Israelis are very friendly to Christians. There are a very small number of extremist, hardcore, ultra-Orthodox Jews who say, yeah, we don't want anybody but Jews in Israel. And I would venture to say they're just as hostile to other Israelis who are not ultra-Orthodox as they are to Christians. Now, you've probably heard in the news about Mike Huckabee complaining to the Ministry of the Interior about changes that were made in visa procedures for Christian pilgrims that want to come to the Holy Land. And they have recently changed some of their procedures and policies, and they've made it much more difficult for Christian tour groups to come to Israel and visit. And let me just say, if you're from the Ministry of Interior in Israel and you're the one that had that bright idea, you're a moron. You should not be doing things right now, especially that hinder people from coming to Israel as tourists, especially the people who support you the most. You should not be doing things to alienate those people. You're an idiot. Some bureaucrat sitting up in the Ministry of Interior just thought, oh, I know what would be a good idea. Let's make this a whole lot more complicated. And you see this all over the place. This is what governments do. Governments are bureaucracies. Everybody's got to be good at something. Bureaucracies are good at making your life miserable. That's all they're good at. And there's some pipe cleaner neck weenie up there in the Ministry of Interior who decided that it would be a fantastic idea to make traveling to the Holy Land as a Christian pilgrim twice as excruciating to try to get a visa. And Ambassador Huckabee took issue with that, and rightly so. And then was even more miffed when the Zoomies up there at the Ministry of Interior doubled down and said, no, this is a great idea. We're going to keep this. So what Ambassador Huckabee is doing is he's going, okay, you want to try that? Fine. We'll go over your head. We'll go higher up in government to somebody till we find somebody who's smart enough to go, that's a stupid idea, and make a phone call and sit on somebody's head in the Ministry of Interior until they change that procedure back and make it easier for people to come in as pilgrims. Ambassador Huckabee's doing the right thing. But this is a bureaucracy thing. This is not a cultural thing. This is not Israel hates Christians. Israelis do not hate Christians. And Christians who live in Israel, who are Israeli, have the best life of the best standard of living of Christians anywhere in the Middle East. The only place in Israel where Christians are not very welcome is in Judea and Samaria and the Hebron. And so the fact that there is only one surviving village of Christians in Samaria doesn't have anything to do with Jews. Doesn't have anything at all to do with Israelis. It has to do with the fact that they're surrounded by 500,000 Muslims who want you to be nothing but Muslim. And if you're not Muslim, they want you to leave. You should not exist The story was that a bunch of radical, illegal Jewish settler extremists randomly came in and set fire to this church and the cemetery in front of it and desecrated the cemetery and busted down the church. And the police came and did an investigation and found out that's absolutely fake. It's false. It did not happen. I talked to Joshua Waller from Hodeidah today. Take a listen to what Josh Waller had to say. So tell me what you did when you went out to the church in Taibe and what you found there.
Yesterday, we went on site to the grounds because we heard some conflicting reports. We saw conflicting videos where they were saying, hey, the Jews burned down a church and a cemetery. And we thought, that just doesn't sound right. And we literally went there. We walked around the entire area of the church and cemetery. And there's no church burned and there's no grave damaged in the entire cemetery. No burnings at all. Now, on the outside of the area, in a field adjacent to the church and the cemetery, there are very small sections, not even a big fire, a very small fire burned where somebody lit multiple fires. I would say like 15 or 20 different little bitty fires were lit all around the area. So the Israeli police just confirmed what we found yesterday. They just put out a report that said the church and cemetery were not harmed. There we go. What really happened then? Then this piece, in my opinion, is another hit piece by the anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian movement to delegitimize Israel and make the Jews look like some sort of equal to Hamas kind of radical groups. That's not true, but they're trying to make up stories to delegitimize the state of Israel. That's what's happening.
So Ambassador Huckabee just went out there and called this an act of terrorism. What's up with that?
So when Huckabee went, he was clear. He used the right words. He said this was an act of terrorism, saying catching fire to anything is an act of terrorism. It should not be done. It was thought that, of course, the Jews did it, and the whole world thinks the Jews did it, but that the evidence for the Jews doing it is not there. And there's tons of videos showing Jews putting out the fires, not starting the fires. The fact that Huckabee went along with it is slightly concerning, and I think he knew better than to say who did it. And of course, he didn't say this is settler violence. He doesn't use words like that. He said this in general, that a fire got that close to the church is a problem. So he didn't go on to say that this was some sort of settler attack.
So you talked to the bishop of the church. What did he have to say?
I asked him, I said, you just told the world that this church and cemetery were burned down by Jews. I said, I came and I walked and I said, that's not what happened. He said, but that's what could have happened. I said, but that's not what happened. The church did not burn. He said, but you got to think of what would happen next time. And that was his response.
Unbelievable. The Palestinian bishop created a story that the media picked up and just ran with. And Israel has been roundly condemned across the globe by governments and NGOs and Christians in the United States all over the place. Even the Trump administration was like, what the heck happened there? What's going on with that? All because of a lie that was perpetrated by a Christian Palestinian bishop. That is the hoax, people. We need to be discerning about this stuff. It's taken a good solid almost 2 weeks to get to the bottom of this story. It should not have taken that long. Since the police report came out and after Ambassador Huckabee went out to the site and saw it, I watched the video of when Huckabee was there. He was very careful with the wording of what he said. He said, this is terrorism and should not happen. He's standing there looking at the grass that's burned down there because it's basically, it looks like what took place was Palestinians were trying to burn down the farm fields of a Jewish farmer who legally lives in that area, who legally farms there. And the fire got blown up the hill by the wind. So Huckabee's looking at that, and he just generally in saying people should not go burning stuff down. But since then, today, Huckabee was asked specifically about his response to that. Now that this police report has come out and said it never happened, there was nothing burned, there was nothing destroyed, there was no desecration of the cemetery. And Huckabee came out and corrected his statement and said, this is fake news. This was all fake. So I don't fault Huckabee for calling for an investigation when something happens. That's what he ought to do. He's a diplomat. He's not sticking to an agenda. He's just going with the truth. So thank you very much for watching. Please make sure that you are subscribed to the channel, and we will see you again next time here on the Hot Zone.